Hello, everyone, and welcome back to one of these. Now, if you did not see the last one, that's okay. That was just a test run. This is the real thing. This is the real deal. So anyone who knows me knows that I love true crime. It's just really interesting getting into the minds of murderers for some reason. Don't look deeper into that. And something that I've noticed is that no one on YouTube really talks about the murder trials of ancient Greece. Now, to be fair, there are not a lot of them. But what we do have are remaining defense speeches. And that is the primary source material that historians use to reconstruct the Greek legal system, for example. I think that doing a video that covers both my interest in true crime and my interest in ancient Greek is just fun. So I'm just going to do that, and hopefully you guys join the ride. And today's case is an unsolved murder mystery, and I'm going to need your help to solve it. That's right. You're going to be a real detective now. Here's your badge. So, as is the case for most, if not all, Greek murder trials, I should say ancient Greek murder trials, because Greece is still there. It hasn't disappeared. So, having said that, one of the earliest ones that we have, actually probably the earliest one that we have, is a defense speech written by this guy named Antiphon. Now, Antiphon was an Attic orator. And the orators in Attic Greece, so in Athens, they were really good speakers. And as amazing speakers, they were often hired to write defense speeches. So a lot of the times you will find that Attic orators are also logographers or speechwriters because they were really good rhetoricians. Lysias, Demosthenes, for example, are other orators of the period. And Antiphon was the first of these. Now, because their job was just being a really good speaker, and also because they were getting hired to write a lot of defense speeches, and even prosecution speeches as well, because of that, they also had to know the law really well. They weren't lawyers proper, but they did have to know the law very well. Now, the history of ancient Greek law goes back pretty far. Now, it really started with the emergence of the city-state. In fact, the earliest evidence comes from Dreros on Crete, where an inscription of a very early Greek law is found. You know, if you've been alive for a number of days, you might have heard the phrase draconic when it comes to law, that a law is draconic. It is somehow awful. It is really extreme. And that phrase doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from this guy, Draco of Athens. So in the 7th century, Draco of Athens prescribed a whole bunch of laws that we now just kind of call draconian. But one guy, Solon, he came around and he was like, you know what? Screw these laws. They are way too draconic. So now I have to come up with new ones. So Solon's reforms were very well taken. People really appreciated them because they were far less severe. Now, the only law that Solon actually kept of Draco's was his law on murder. Even after revisions in the 5th century, so after Solon had long passed and they decided to reform the institution again, even after those and they weren't Solon's laws proper anymore, people still called them Solon's laws because he was the ancient Greek lawgiver. He was their guy. The ancient Greeks believed that it was so important that these laws be remembered and communicated that they made a big public showing of it. These laws had to be written down and given to everybody. Everybody had to have access to these laws somehow, because before these, since laws weren't encoded in the same way, they were often memorized through song. In fact, if you messed up a song and improperly recited the ancient Greek law, you would have a teen curse. This is Tean. This is a curse that would be put upon you because you have messed up the law. So I should note that while Draco himself is generally accepted as a historical person, there is a decent argument to be made that he wasn't a real person. This isn't going to be the point of the video. He very easily could have been real. It doesn't really matter, honestly. But because he only comes along with the laws, like you have Draco only ever being talked about with Draco's laws. You don't ever have the laws separate from Draco or Draco separate from the laws. And because of that, people have this idea that he was an ancient Greek lawgiver figure in the same way that Moses is a lawgiver for the Jews. It's important to remember that I am not specifically advocating for this view, but I did feel the need to mention it because this is pointed out in Plastow's book. But anyways, people, including especially the Attic Orators, were really encouraged to learn and recite these laws. And thus we arrive at Antiphon, the first of the Attic Orators. Antiphon was born around 480 BCE, and we have 15 existing pieces of writing from him. And out of these 15, only 3 are from real trials. The other 12 are honestly from what we would now call mock trials. They were used in his school to practice law. Now, this was all for the attainment of really good rhetoric. In fact, he literally wrote the book on good rhetoric. Literally, a book about good rhetoric. It was really important that not just your legal knowledge be good, but also how good the argument was, even if it wasn't actually a good argument. And sometimes I still wonder if these guys were idiots or geniuses, because the arguments themselves would probably not pass in a modern day court. But if you're a really good, charismatic speaker, you can convince anybody of anything. And the one of the Greek terms that is used for these trials is agon, which means competition. So as you can see the association of being a good speaker there. Trials were held in front of the demos. These were the populace, the regular everyday people. Anywhere between 201 or 501, it had to be an odd number though. It had to be an odd number because that's how tiebreakers work. Anywhere between those number of people, they would be all gathered together. And the trial would be held in different settings, and I will cover some of those in a bit. These jurors were randomly selected Athenians, but they had to represent the 10 tribes. And because the crowd would get rowdy, there was really no juror etiquette like we have now. They would get wild. They needed to have security detail, actual security detail, to have the jurors at bay. In fact, just to keep them from conspiring or deliberating, as we would now call it, during the trial, what they would do is they would essentially pull the old classic, change places! And of course, then their positions would all be shifted and they couldn't continue whatever conversation they were having about the trial. Deliberation was quick. It was short and sweet. Trials were often very different lengths as well. Each trial had its own set length. Sometimes the clock would be stopped. And when I say clock, what I mean is water clock, a klepsydra. This klepsydra would measure anywhere between 15 minutes and a third of the day. I mean, the trial time had a very wide range. Sometimes the clock would be stopped for the reading of the witness statements, and other times they'd just let it go. So Antiphon was very well acquainted with this system. In fact, in 411, he defended the allied state against Athens and was executed after the coup of 411. The democracy was reinstated, and he was convicted of treason. And it's a really sad way to end such an influential life. But Antiphon's life is not the cornerstone of this video. Instead, let's talk about a murder. So, the defending speech we have, this is concerning the murder of Herodes. So we have a man who was accused of murder, and he has Antiphon write a speech for him. And the thing is, it was looked down upon in Greek society to have someone else speak for you. Now we have lawyers, and it's just common practice to have someone else speak for you. But in ancient Greece, if you went up there and didn't defend yourself, you were viewed as a coward. You couldn't even defend yourself. You had to get someone else to do it. That was their mentality. And that is why they had speech writers do the hard work for them. But they would still have to get up there and present their own case. So the man's name is Euxitheus, but the name doesn't appear anywhere in the text. The name Euxitheus actually comes from a 4th century CE, so this is like 800 years later, a 4th century CE text from Sopater. Now, this entire text is untranslated. There is no English version of this text anywhere that I could find. So I decided to translate it myself. Not the whole thing. I found the part that I needed to find, and I translated that part for now. But I feel like this is a much bigger project, me translating this untranslated Greek work. That's a whole other story. But this one name, Euxitheus, pops up here. And I'm going to read out the quote to you. Euxitheus and Herodes were sailing together. Euxitheus was found sleeping next to blood and accused of villainy, for he had established the guise in order that he did not incur a penalty and in order not to be judged. However, the murder was proven. So yes, that is the only extant English translation of that. I am a true pioneer. Please subscribe. But yeah, this was written hundreds of years later, and he uses it as part of a greater argument. And it's kind of a throwaway line for him, honestly. Now, the name of this person shouldn't matter, right? It really shouldn't. But did Sopater have different sources? Did he have better sources than we do? Possibly. Totally. I mean, this was hundreds of years after the case, but that's still hundreds of years before us today. So it's completely possible that he had information that we didn't. On the other hand, he also says that the case was shown to be a murder, that Euxitheus was shown to be a criminal. And the interesting thing is that while scholars, because of tradition, have been like, okay, well, you know what? We don't have a name for this guy, but Sopater, in this one other reference to this trial in all ancient literature, says that his name was Euxitheus. We can just call him Euxitheus. It's not a big deal. And I agree. It isn't a big deal. But also there's a part of me that's asking, well, what if it wasn't his name? It doesn't really matter, right? This is like a dissertation level thing. Like, what if it meant in the same guise as like Karen or Einstein? Like, these words, they are names that people can certainly be named and have been named. But the reason that we use them in common nomenclature to mean, in the case of Einstein, smart, in the case of Karen, I guess stuck up, the reason that we do that is because they are based on real people who exhibit certain traits. So perhaps Euxitheus was a name like that. That's entirely conjecture, by the way. There's absolutely no evidence for this. But that is a possibility. There are other possibilities as well. It also could just as easily be his name was Euxitheus, and it doesn't matter. Why do you care about this, Lawrence? You're stupid. You're stupid for caring about this. It doesn't fucking matter. And I agree. It doesn't matter. So let's move on. So how about we start covering this case? The defense speech starts with Antiphon saying, "Of course I didn't kill this guy." And by the way, and this is what makes me question whether or not the orators were intelligent or if they were idiots, because it's a defense like this. Antiphon has Euxitheus say, and from now on, I will just be saying Euxitheus said or Euxitheus says, even though Antiphon wrote the speech. You get it? You get it. Euxitheus says that he's a bad speaker, and because of that, if he messes up, then, well, it's just because he's a bad speaker. You shouldn't take him seriously. He's a really bad speaker. You know, if he contradicts himself, it's just because he's a bad speaker, guys. But if he says something that is delightful and very well received, it's because he's telling the truth. This is an actual argument that's used in this, by the way. That's an actual argument that Antiphon was like, yes, that sounds convincing to me. Let's roll with it. Here's the actual translation of that part. On the one hand, if I fail at some of this by word of mouth, have forgiveness for me, and believe that this has been a mistake by inexperience more than injustice. On the other hand, if I speak some of this correctly, it has been spoken by truth more than by cleverness. In this case, cleverness is deceitfulness. Now, one of the opening arguments is that this trial is already a farce. And essentially, there were a lot, and I mean a lot, of different ways to try murder in ancient Greece. So the argument here is essentially that this is not being tried under the proper circumstances. So the prosecution says that he is a kakurgos, which means a malefactor, a robber, or a thief. He's not being called a murderer. He is being accused of murder, but in the trial, they are not calling him a murderer because a trial for thievery or something like that is very different than a dikephonu, a murder trial. Under a dikephonu, for example, you would have essentially a private court. And this case, as is noted, is held in the Agora. This is a public forum. You can kind of think of this like the Roman Forum, except no loitering. And the issue here is that he is being called a malefactor, a thief, a robber, but they are still accusing him of murder. Now, it might sound weird. Well, if you are accusing him of murder, shouldn't you have a murder trial? Well, you should, but he wasn't a citizen, so the same rules didn't apply to him. And I have my own reason for thinking why they did this, and I'll get to that by the end of the video. But let's continue. There are lots of ways you can try murder in ancient Greece. But it's important to remember that if you're trying someone for being a thief, that's an entirely different case structure. So the method for trying thieves was an epigoke. And essentially, for this trial format, the accused had to be taken in the act. This was a very important part of it. So this was in accordance with the laws of Solon, actually. It even goes back that far. Essentially, what would have to take place of being caught in the act was that, of course, you had to be stealing the thing at the time. That's number one. But this was essentially a citizen's arrest. So the person would be taken and brought in front of the magistrates. In fact, under this kind of trial, death was not the solution. So one of Solon's laws, actually, against Draco was that these people should be taken and not be put to death. You should have a different punishment, not death. It's very specific here. Solon, in his law against thieves, thought they should be punished not as Draco had thought previously, by death, but by twofold restitution. And while this may seem like a less harsh punishment, and it is, the rub is that there were certain conditions in Athens where this wouldn't apply. One of these exceptions is if they were caught in the act. So what are some of the different homicide courts of Athens? And I should say that different homicide courts. So first of all, there's the big one. There's the Areopagus. This is probably the most famous one in Athens, and it's located on the hill of Ares in one of its origin stories, interestingly enough. It was thought that Ares was actually the first to be tried there. There are other court origin stories, but the Areopagus is always the most interesting and prominent one. So that's the only origin story that I'm bothering to actually mention here. But this was used for intentional murders and trauma cases. The Palladian was another big one, far less influential than the Areopagus, but still pretty big. This was for unintentional murders or murders involving slaves, or maybe even conspiracy to commit, something like that. Then there was the Prutaneion. Now this one, you're going to love this one. When the murderer was an animal, they would try them. That's right. It's for animals. This it was real, guys. They tried animals for murder. Then there was the Delphinian. This was for lawful murders, and yes, there were those too. And I actually do eventually want to cover a case for one of those murders. I think it'll be really interesting. Then there was the Freato. This was an offshore trial for exiled persons. This is a new phenomena for someone like Euxitheus because he notes that he is the first person to be accused of murder, but to be tried as a malefactor. Now, it's not entirely clear this is what he says. Here's the translation of that section. All translations are my own, by the way. Firstly, I am being prosecuted for murder and have been marked as a malefactor, which no one has ever experienced in this land of the Athenians, and thus I am certainly not a criminal, nor am I liable to the laws of the thieves. Indeed, they themselves, the prosecution, have become witnesses of this. Now, the one big translation issue that you have with this is the fact that you have a genitive article with no noun. Now, this can usually this means the people, so it's often taken to mean the Athenians there, the land of the Athenians. However, it could be from the prosecution, or it could be their deeds. It could be a whole bunch of things, but the Athenians is usually what people mean. So I should say that one is not entirely clear. Now, there have been some scholars that have suggested that this was a very common occurrence, and he doesn't know what Euxitheus is talking about. This is our first reference to something like this. So, he very easily could have been the first one or one of the first people to experience this kind of, yes, we're accusing you of murder, but we're trying you as a thief kind of thing. So, yes, we do have other examples. They're all after Euxitheus and the murder of Herodes. They're all after this case. So, I feel like you could still say it's totally possible that this was not a common thing, which is why he's so shocked. Now, it has also been argued that you could say that, in a way, murder is thievery. It's a malefaction, because if you kill someone, you are taking them, i.e. stealing them, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, from the community. So, co-parter. But one of the big points is that because this was not in front of the Areopagus, and instead this was in front of a different court, they could act differently. Because in front of the Areopagus, you had to bring evidence. You had to be very professional the whole time. And importantly, you had to have no appeals to emotion. In a trial setting like this, you could have all the appeals to emotion you want. In fact, in front of the Areopagus, people were very weary not to make appeals to emotion because they'd be thrown out. And by the way, this is called a Heliastic court, the one that Euxitheus is being tried in. So one of the very first things that you would do in a trial is take an oath. And depending on the trial, you would have to take a different oath. And one of the claims by Euxitheus is that the prosecution took a different oath. They're not taking the right oath for this kind of trial setting. So obviously, we can't continue these proceedings. And these oaths were very important. Sometimes trials were decided on the oath. Because this was an appeal to the gods, you had to swear upon it. In fact, you had to invoke evil destruction upon yourself if you weren't entirely honest. So sometimes trials were entirely decided before the actual trial part of the trial based on the oath. Xenophanes, Homer, and others mention cheating by oath. This was essentially where a potentially dishonest oath taker would simply disregard the oath or follow through with the oath thinking that they'll get away with it if they lie. So this left the good oath taker at a disadvantage from the very beginning. And once again, oaths were even described as far back as Solon's laws. There was also an option for an oath of denial, meaning they could essentially claim to have no knowledge of the incident or that they had nothing to do with it. Now, in their worldview, the only beings that could really be vengeful about a broken oath are the gods. But you could also see how this kind of system, no matter how strongly believed, was easily abused. Now, one of the main criticisms that he rails initially in the beginning of the speech is that this is being the wrong trial format. And the thing is, under a dikaiphonu, a regular murder trial, you have the option to leave the country because he's not a citizen. He doesn't have to follow the exact same rules as an Athenian citizen. So the way a murder trial works, or a dikaiphonu works, is something like this. Initially, you have a charge sent to the basileus, one of the 9 archons. These guys took care of all the preliminary stuff. If the basileus agreed to allow this trial on the presented grounds, the accused would be barred from the agora, that would be the public forum, since they did not want to taint the air with their sinfulness, or whatever. In Athens, the agora was the space outside the Acropolis that included some buildings and open courtyard areas. They would secure the attendance of both the accused and the witnesses. So think of it like this. Witnesses were not quite the same as they are now. They kind of acted more like witnesses to a signing, if anything. And they would essentially say, yes, this happened, or no, that didn't happen. They weren't there to go up on stand and present their own account of events. They had written statements, and they would sign them, and they would actually put that in a jar, actually. And these jars were essentially the evidence boxes. This is what would be covered in the actual trial. So these clay jars were called ekinoi. And during the trial, a court secretary would pull out whatever witness statement needed to be read, and then they would read it. So after the evidence had been gathered, you would take your prescribed oaths, and the trial would begin. There were 2 rounds of speaking, and a conviction meant the death penalty. Interestingly, if you were on trial and you thought that you were going to lose the case, you could bow out right before round 2. So round 1 would happen, and if you're feeling really not confident about the way the trial is going, you could just leave. You could just yeet yourself into exile. You would have to leave the battlefield, and that's it. You could easily get away with murder like this. Like, yeah, you have to be in exile, but they didn't kill you because the trial never finished, essentially. If you were really not comfortable with how the case was going, you could just leave. But essentially, this is why Euxitheus is so angry about the trial format. In a trial like this, Euxitheus wasn't allowed to leave. Now, Antiphon's greater point for him was that Euxitheus is just having the deck stacked against him. Euxitheus even says that he was held by the 11. Now, these guys were essentially prison guards, but of course, their only job was really for the transportation of people who are accused, and of course of criminals. But they would, of course beat people when they wanted to. That was just their thing. They liked to do that. They weren't allowed to, but they did anyways. Boy, am I glad that part of history is over. Isn't it amazing that we live in a time where there is no such thing as police brutality? It's amazing. We have advanced so much. I'm so happy to have evolved past a time where law enforcement physically assaults prisoners for no reason other than them just wanting to. Isn't that great that we live in a time like that? Nothing like that happens now in the 21st century. Perfect time. Very proud to be a part of this species. So after describing how the deck is essentially stacked against him, Euxitheus hops into the narrative portion. He starts to tell you his account of what happened. So Euxitheus and Herodes were on a boat, and they were sailing from Mytilene to Ainos. So Euxitheus was going to visit his dad, and Herodes was actually going to release some slaves. Now, on their way, according to Euxitheus, there was a storm. And that meant they had to stop somewhere. And the city that they went to stop at was Methymna. Now here at port, the prosecution claims that this is where Herodes was killed. Because we have this missing guy, Herodes, and they have, of course, accused Euxitheus of being the murderer. But he essentially goes through his case. He says things like, we didn't really plan this stop. Like, why would I do it here? And furthermore, I didn't ask him to come either. He came for his own business and I came for mine. Now, according to Euxitheus, he and the guys were all up drinking at night. They got pretty drunk. They stayed up all night. And Herodes essentially just left the boat and then never came back. And then because they didn't want to wait any longer in the morning, they just left without Herodes. He even said that he led his own investigation. The prosecution is claiming that Euxitheus had hit Herodes on the head with a rock. But now there's no body. Now, we'll get into their evidence, and this is, of course, the defense speech, so this is one account. But it's still interesting to go through. And Euxitheus counters this claim by saying, listen, I was so drunk that night, there was no shot I could have sneakily hid that body. Someone surely would have seen me. And then to this, the prosecution claimed that, well, he just threw his body into the sea. So yes, after arriving at Mytilene with no Herodes, this is the initial place that Euxitheus was heading before the storm. So after they arrive at Mytilene sometime later, and back at Mythimna, where the murder is said to have happened, they hold an investigation. And the prosecution finds blood. They find blood on the ship, and they claim that it is from Herodes, that this is where the murder happened. But then Euxitheus responds, no, that is sheep's blood. And of course, time before any kind of blood analysis existed, yeah, you could easily get away with something like that. Now, the prosecution took two men for questioning. One of these was a slave, and one of them was a freeman. And the freeman essentially said the whole time, like, no, he didn't do it. He didn't kill anybody. And the prosecution couldn't really do much about it. But the slave, because he's a slave, was tortured a lot. And eventually, after denying all these claims about Euxitheus being a murderer, he says, yeah, he did it. He did. I completely admit that he committed the murder. Now, according to Euxitheus, he admitted this because he was looking for, he was promised his release. But after, and this is attested by the prosecution as well, from what is said in the defense speech, that after incriminating Euxitheus, the slave recants his testimony and says, no, he didn't do anything. And the argument given by Euxitheus is that this is because he was not granted his freedom, that he was promised his freedom but not granted it. And he was like, well, in that case, I'll just tell the truth then. He didn't kill anyone. So really back and forth stuff here. And the thing is, there was no witness questioning process here. There was no back and forth. No. Instead, because this was a slave, they didn't have to sign a witness statement the same way their owners had to sign a witness statement. And in this case, it would be the prosecution. So, and you're seeing a lot of sus things. I know. I'm seeing them too. It should be obvious, right? We'll get there. So essentially, they kill the slave. After he recants his testimony, they kill the slave and they write this witness statement and then call it a day, because that's all they had to do. And Euxitheus didn't get a chance to question him. In fact, he even laments that fact. He's like, if I would have tortured him, he would have said what I wanted him to say. Yeah, right? But then we get to one of the most interesting points in the section. And this is where this is kind of looking sus, like, yeah, prosecution looks like they're setting him up. This is where it gets really weird, because this next part looks like it's self-incrimination. And before you come at me with, oh, well, Lawrence, he's just a bad speaker. Shut the fuck up, all right? So I don't know what the name for for this specific kind of self-incrimination is, or even if there is one. I'm not a lawyer. Thank Zeus for that. But here is my translation of this self-incriminating comment. But even still, they say these things, that while being tortured, the slave admitted that he killed Herodes together with me. But I say that he certainly did not say this, but that he led the man and I away from the ship, and that the man was killed by me immediately, and that he threw him into the sea after taking him and putting him into the ship together with me. In any other context, this kind of correction would be incredibly suspicious. Picture this. So imagine a cop telling you that your friend just implicated you in a crime by saying that you were the one shooting the gun out the window in that hit and run on the subway employee who didn't quite understand what a full handful of lettuce was. And you go, no, he didn't say that. What he said was that I was too afraid to hold the firearm, so I chose to shit in my hands and clap instead, you fucking donut. The cop would immediately think that you shit in your hands and clapped. I chose those examples for no specific reason. Don't look any further into it. Please and thank you. And because of this killing of the slave, and this is, first of all, tell me what you think of that self-incriminating statement. If there are any lawyers out there, I'm sorry, but also, please help me with this term that I'm looking for. There must be one. Surely there is one. Now, because the prosecution had murdered the witness, Euxitheus is all like, hey, you unlawfully killed somebody. You're the one breaking the law. Therefore, you're untrustworthy. And essentially he's like, but you kind of thing. No, you. Now, after a variety of defenses, the prosecution, or at least according to Euxitheus again, has brought another piece of evidence. This would be a letter that Euxitheus wrote to his friend Licinus. Now, in this letter, the prosecution claims that Euxitheus admitted guilt. And they also claim that Licinus is actually an accomplice in some way. And Euxitheus actually uses this to his advantage. Here's a translation of that section. But they say that they found a letter in the ship which I sent to Licinus, since I killed the man. And is it even necessary that I send a letter when the letter I carry shares his knowledge? Meaning, of course, why would you write a letter saying that you killed someone when the person that you're writing it to already knows that you killed someone? Now, they go into questioning motives. Why would Licinus or himself want Herodes dead? They wouldn't. They literally had no reason to. It wasn't money because they had plenty of money. It couldn't have been any personal issue because they barely knew the guy. Now, another argument that is presented here is that a lot of people have lost lives based on false accusations. And they actually point out two very well-known cases. Now, the first case that is presented is the killing of Ephialtes. So the murder is unknown, but this was committed 45 years before the events of this trial. So with Pericles, Ephialtes committed an attack upon the prerogatives of the Areopagus in 462. He was then assassinated. Aristotle claims that it was done by Aristodicus of Tangara. Now the claim is made by Euxitheus that this was an unsolved case. But as you can see, Aristotle does mention that it was done by somebody. So I don't know how seriously you want to take either of these accounts. Do with that what you will. But either way, it suited Antiphon's purposes that the case remained unsolved. And then he mentions the killing of the Helen Taomai. So these were essentially, you could think of them like bankers for the Delian League. They would distribute funds, and they were accused of embezzlement. And of course, I can't believe this was a real thing. The penalty for that was, of course, murder. So they started killing all of them, except for one. There were 10 people, 9 of them were executed. But then the last one was saved just in time because they discovered essentially a clerical error. There was an accounting error and 9 people died. So, as you can see why this is useful to the case that is being presented. A lot of innocent people have died because of false things. So, maybe you guys should not be so trigger happy is the case that Euxitheus is making. Now, one of the weird things that I saw in this case, aside from all the other weird shit, in this case, there is also a defense of his father. He feels the need to defend his dad. So they were somehow implicating his dad in something, even though his dad was away, literally had nothing to do with it. Euxitheus was going to visit his dad when this murder is said to have happened. So why feel the need to defend your father? Now, at first I was thinking, well, maybe this is like some family pride thing, right? Like if one is looked down upon, so is the father. And in some sense, yes, but that's not the full story. Now, the thing that he's defending his father against is another accusation. And this kind of shows you how lax the trial system sometimes was. So they would have specific trial setups, but they could talk about whatever the hell they wanted, essentially. At least that's how it was used. It wasn't supposed to be used that way, but it was a lot of the time. So the thing that we need to talk about to understand the defense of his father, why he feels the need to even mention his dad, is the Mightileni Revolt. Now remember, from the beginning, Euxitheus and his dad are from Mytilene. So after the Athenian treasury moved to Athens in 454 BCE, Athens could begin to gain information about its subordinate states, including their attitudes towards their rulers. The people of Mytilene did not take kindly to this action, but could not launch a full-on attack since the people could barely support their own navy. Mytilene staged a revolt with all the cities of Lesbos except Methymna, but ultimately their revolt did not succeed. Now, if you remember, where did they stop? During the storm, they stopped at Methymna. This was the one place that did not, on the entire island of Lesbos, that did not rise in revolt against Athens. So, if you have people or someone from the family of someone who's thought to be part of that revolt, so his dad, essentially, was part of that revolt. And if the people somehow found that out, maybe that gives them a reason to find justice. And I'll get more into it later. But remember, that's the one city on Lesbos that did not rise up in the Mytilene Revolt. But either way, the city itself, Mytilene, was captured, and their fate was determined. As noted by Thucydides, this guy Cleon wanted to kill all the people for revolting. He was arguing that they should all be killed. They should be used as an example. Now, of course, that was Cleon. Cleon is the prosecution, essentially. Their fate is being debated, and the defense for them, essentially, is this guy, Diodotus. And Diodotus argues all of Cleon's arguments. And essentially, he says this: if we kill them, they can't be more useful to Athens. They are more useful to Athens alive than dead. He also notes that the previous laws to deter crime and revolts didn't work, so why would this new display of slaughter work as well? Why would that one work when nothing else has worked? There's no reason that doing the same shit over and over again should work when it doesn't work all the other times. And his final argument against them is that really a variety of social factors led to this behavior, so it's probably all a little of our faults. And the people of Mytilene are spared. He makes a convincing argument against the death penalty for everybody. Against the genocide. He makes a convincing argument against genocide. So, great. Good job, Diodotus. You did it. So, in my summation, what happened with this trial, why he felt the need to defend his dad, the prosecution essentially wanted to take revenge for the Mytilene Revolt. They didn't get justice the way they wanted for the trial, so now they have a person to put that in. They essentially had they had this one guy, Euxitheus, and his dad, and now they have a route to actually take justice, even if it's not the same justice they were looking for. They could at least move things in a certain direction to get some revenge. But essentially, Euxitheus in this speech is left defending his father. I also wrote a pretty detailed argument on this, on why I think that connection is there, aside from the stuff that I pointed out here. But if you want to read that paper, it is on our Patreon page, and it is actually in our Discord server. So, join that, both of those. Thanks. Now, the rest of the speech is really an argument from religion. The gods wouldn't like this if I'm innocent, stuff like that. And then he essentially ends off with one final plea for his life. Like, this is the one life I have. Like, this is the most important possible thing for any of you. And like, if any of you guys decides the wrong way, if you get it wrong and I die, like, judgment will be on you. The blood will be on your hands. So make sure you are very diligent in making your decision. So that was essentially his argument there. So, conclusions for the case. Final thoughts on the murder of Herodes. And the whole case seems to really be in Euxitheus' favor. Every single contention, I think, had a pretty good response from the defense. However, we get to that self-incriminating portion, and then I'm like, wait, hold up. Are we sure? Are we sure about those arguments? Maybe Antiphon really was this amazing orator if he can slip that in and still convince people. I don't know. Like, he can still make those good arguments, but then there's like the one hint of truth there, but I don't know. Now, of course, this is just one part of the trial, right? This is one defense speech. We don't have the prosecution's speech. That is just not extant anymore. So they could have had amazing arguments. And one of the things that I noted before about where Euxitheus' name came from, this one source 700, 800 years later about this trial, that's where the name comes from. The trial ending is given there too, but people generally, especially for me, I've been reading in books, and I have been, even in my Greek course where we were translating a lot of the works of the Attic Orators, we were told, there's no ending to this trial. We don't know how it ended. And I know that it's easier to take a name than it is to take the ending of a trial, right? Because one is far more believable just by nature than it is than the other thing. So it's just a really interesting case. Like, is the name used polemically, or was this really was this used just to make Sopater's greater point, or was the ending to the trial truly that he was ruled as a murderer, that he was convicted? Now, I don't know exactly where to go with this trial, so I'm leaving the question off to you. What do you think? Did Euxitheus commit murder? Did he kill Herodes on that boat? Did he throw the body off the ship? Is it a no body, no crime kind of case for you? I want to hear your thoughts, because I am relying on the comments section to solve a 2,000-year-old murder. So good luck with that. Debate all you want. But hopefully in this video, you were able to find something interesting, maybe about the murder itself. Maybe it wasn't a murder. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe he did just waltz off the boat in a drunken stupor. But maybe you also learned something about the Athenian legal system, because I know I sure did. So, if you guys enjoyed this episode of whatever the hell this show is, make sure to drop a like, subscribe if you haven't, all that good stuff. Share it around, friends, family, neighbors, Herodes, prosecutions, defendants, all those people. Make sure to do that. Big thank you to all of our patrons who are absolutely wild all the time. Love those guys. Every single last one of them. And ladies, guys and ladies, I should say that. And non-binaries. Either way, appreciate all of you guys. Join the Discord server. We got shirts on Teespring, all that good stuff. All links are in the description. Sources will be in the description as well if you want to continue your studies. So, thanks for joining me. And thanks for watching.